He-Man, the most powerful man in the universe.
The 80s were really the era of cartoons. We got so many good ones, right? And He-Man was one of them. However, for a show that had big cultural impact, the cartoon ended very quietly. Like literally one afternoon, the show just ended. So, of course, we gotta wonder, why did the show, which had so much impact on us and children's television as a whole, have such an anticlimactic ending? Well, that's what we'll be looking into in this video. Let's talk about how it ended. The show that changed everything. He-Man and the Masters of the Universe began airing in first-run syndication in September 1983, produced by Filmation Studios and built directly around Mattel's toy line that we all know and love. So, you can understand this was a big thing, and this was one of the first major syndicated television series built around a toy line. This business model seems pretty common now, but back then it was one of a kind. The FCC back then had relaxed its restriction on toy-based programming, and Mattel and Filmation didn't want to waste any time. Lou Shamer, the co-founder of Filmation, negotiated this deal where Mattel could tell Filmation which characters and vehicles would need to show up in the show so that they could get that bag. But Filmation still handled the stories as self-contained adventures with clear morals. So overall, I would say this was a pretty good deal. And for this deal, the production scale was genuinely awe-inspiring. Because you see, back then, many animated series would have 13 episodes per season, right? Filmation went for 5 times that. Yeah, they committed to 65 episodes per season, 5 days a week, which meant the writing staff had to work every day. Kind of like Mappa Animation Studios now with Jujutsu Kaisen, you know? And Filmation did that for 2 seasons, 130 episodes total. For the first time ever in a toy and a syndication deal of this scale, I would say He-Man really cashed out, because that show was airing on 152 US stations with a 10.9 rating among children aged 2 to 11. It was that popular. And in the writer's room, you had J. Michael Straczynski, the man who went on to create Babylon 5. This was one of his big early television breaks. According to the Television Academy's archive interview with Straczynski, he talked about how much he loved cartoons.
I like cartoons. I've always loved cartoons. My house is filled with cartoon artwork.
And at one point, when he left journalism, he decided to take a stab at writing for animated shows. So he wrote for He-Man and became a part of the Filmation writing team. He went on to write multiple episodes in the show's second season before becoming one of the key creative voices connected to the She-Ra spinoff we know and love. If you watch the interview fully, you'll also find out that the production really wanted to circle around the toys for the stories, and they insisted that every single episode end with some kind of moral. We also had Paul Dini, the man who would go on to write the defining episodes of Batman the Animated Series and co-create Harley Quinn in the writer's room. He started his career doing freelance animation scripts for Filmation while in college, and in a 2019 interview with Starburst magazine, Dini recalled just how the Filmation executives responded to his portfolio back then. I was lucky enough to have the meeting with one of the heads of Filmation Studios, who would go on to later produce the He-Man and the Masters of the Universe series. He liked my writing and cartooning and said, "It's not the animation we do, but it shows that you can think visually, so by all means show us some stuff." So while I was in college, I basically deluged the studio with ideas, and they wound up hiring me for about a year. I was able to get my feet wet in doing animation, and later on, when I moved down to California full-time, they had a job for me helping develop Masters of the Universe's series that was just coming around at that time. The episodes that Denny went on to write became fan favorites. Denny has been candid over the years that Filmation's production system could feel very machine-like, but it goes to show that whether or not it was intended, He-Man's writer room was the training ground for several people who would shape the next decade of animation in America. And yeah, before I forget, David Wise, the head writer of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, was also a He-Man writer. So when I tell you He-Man paved the way in a lot of ways, I mean it. He-Mania, the peak and the cracks. Between 1983 and 1985, Masters of the Universe was one of the dominant toy franchises on the planet. It was inescapable. The toys, the video games, the lunchboxes, anything you could think of as merch, He-Man was there. He-Man was the most powerful man in the universe, and Mattel was going to shove it down your throat whether you liked it or not. And in 1986, the toy revenue peak came with approximately $400 million. But then, in 1987, the revenue reportedly fell to around $7 million. Now, $7 million is still a lot of money, but when you compare it with hundreds of millions in toy revenue, that's a cliff's edge. Because of this massive drop, He-Man suddenly looked far less powerful as a business engine than it had just a year earlier. So what happened? Well, many things happened all at once. By that time, Transformers had joined the rat race, and it was a cultural phenomenon on its own. The audience of young boys was pulled into a new direction, and the Transformers animated series started to eat into He-Man's audience share. Then you have Nintendo, which launched the NES in America's market in 1985. And suddenly, the kids could control something on the screen instead of just watching it. So with all those considered, childhood entertainment shifted permanently. And as for Mattel, they were releasing products that made fewer and fewer connections to the characters that the children saw on television. So the whole desire to buy the newest launch was getting diluted. And by that time, the show was also nearing the end of its first run life. The first syndication cycle ran through 1985. And even though reruns continued for years, including on the USA Network until September of 1990, the original Filmation production momentum was already over. It was inevitable, obviously, but you gotta admit, there's something astounding about the franchise still having major toy momentum in 1986, even after the original cartoon production had stopped pushing new He-Man episodes forward. The Secret of the Sword, the real transition point. Now, the studio could have built towards a proper He-Man series finale, but Filmation and Mattel instead moved the franchise toward He-Man and She-Ra, The Secret of the Sword, the animated theatrical film that premiered in cinemas on March 22, 1985. Why? Because this movie was designed as the 5-part launch story for She-Ra, Princess of Power. In this film, we saw He-Man go on this mysterious quest that revealed he had a twin sister who was kidnapped by Hordak at birth and was raised as one of his own. The Princess Adora goes on to become She-Ra, the Princess of Power, and when He-Man goes home to Eternia, She-Ra goes to lead her own rebellion in her own world, Etheria. Commercially, this kind of made sense. Mattel had She-Ra, a new toy line to sell to girls, so this film was a launch vehicle for her. As for He-Man, this film gives him what's structurally a major family reveal and a big expansion of his world, but not an emotionally complete finale. In his autobiography, Lou Shamer said that Filmation's mission with the He-Man franchise was to create shows that were about something. The Cartoon Brew obituary that was published after his death confirmed that Shamer genuinely believed in the educational and moral dimensions of his shows. And this whole decision of not completing He-Man's chapter and expanding the universe was all about the whole idea that the characters in the world had something else to offer the audiences beyond He-Man. But you know what the biggest irony of this whole thing is? She-Ra, Princess of Power ran for 93 episodes, and it also ended without a big final episode style closure. So basically, you could tell that the franchise just developed the habit of not giving us closure. The Cold Zone, the actual final episode. Let's look at the production and broadcast order. According to episode guides, the 130th and final episode of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe is The Cold Zone. It aired as the last episode of the original Filmation run on November 21st, 1985. That tells you just how differently scheduling worked back in the day. And the plot? Well, you have Prince Adam, Cringer, Man-at-Arms, and Orko at the Royal Palace when Cobra Khan shows up. He wants help because the eternal flame of his people has gone out, and he needs Adam to help them. And He-Man and his team agree to help him. On the way there, Cobra Khan even saves Man-at-Arms from a falling tree, which helps him earn the hero's trust. But then, when the team reaches the Eternal Flame Chamber, Cobra Khan disappears and his people, the Raptors, show up, blaming He-Man and the heroes for extinguishing their sacred flame. Yeah, Cobra Khan double-crossed them. He extinguished the flame using an ice crystal and then set up He-Man to take the blame, so that Cobra Khan could swoop in and restore the flame, getting on the Repton's good side. In theory, the plan would work out, but the ice crystal extinguished the Eternal Flame completely. Eventually, our boy He-Man pulls through and relights the Eternal Flame from below by using the planet's molten rock layer. Cobra Khan is defeated. King Pythos restores order, and Man-at-Arms delivers the episode's moral, which is, don't jump to conclusions, look at both sides. Man-at-Arms says, "Today we learn the importance of making the right decisions. When Cobra Khan lied about He-Man, King Pythos believed him at first because Cobra Khan was one of his people. But later he learned that trusting Cobra Khan was a big mistake. So, when you have to make a decision about something, don't jump in at the first or easiest answer. Think it through, look at both sides, and then decide. That way, whatever decisions you make will have a better chance of being the correct ones. See you next time!" And from this little moral, you can tell they had no plans of ending the show here. It's a decent episode of He-Man, but it isn't the finale.
Back Battle Cat.
The cast that carried it. You have to admit that the cast carried the show completely. John Irwin voiced He-Man and Prince Adam across the original run and continued to voice the character in related Filmation appearances. He was warm and sincere as He-Man, which made this character genuinely worth trusting. That's why children were ready to buy into this character's authority and look up to him, you know? Alan Oppenheimer voiced Cringer, Man-at-Arms, and Skeletor, which is a huge range for him. His Skeletor literally lives in our heads at all times. He made this villain enjoyable, even when Skeletor was failing at everything. And that's why Oppenheimer returning to the franchise decades later in Kevin Smith's Masters of the Universe Revelation felt like such a nostalgic full circle moment. Lastly, we have Linda Gray, who voiced Tila, Evelyn, and the Sorceress, giving us range and distinction. None of these characters is the same as the others, and Linda Gray blends into each character seamlessly. Also, did you know that Lou Shamer voiced Orko, Cobra Khan, and many supporting characters? Yeah, he voiced them under the pseudonym Eric Gundon because he didn't want audiences to see the same name in the producer credits and the cast list. Say what you want, but you could tell this was his passion project. Everyone involved in the project really cared about the show, so it makes it even weirder that we got the ending we did.
And more. Well, time for me to disappear. Bye.
No announcement, no farewell, just silence. And this is where we come to the core truth of what happened. The show never got a final episode because nobody made a decision to create one. The production ended because the original 130 episode run had been fulfilled, and the toy and television strategy was already moving towards She-Ra and other franchise extensions. And the series was built around self-contained adventures rather than a serialized endgame. They wanted to move on, and so they did. And for children watching at the time, this kind of movement was very invisible because the show just felt like it was going on. But now that I'm an adult and returned to the show, nothing actually ever got resolved. Skeletor never permanently breached Castle Grayskull, something that he wanted to do so desperately. Prince Adam's secret was never revealed to all of Eternia, and the Sorceress's deeper identity and personal history were never fully explored in the original Filmation series itself. It feels like every episode was a complete story in itself, and there was no need to actually complete the threads that were left unfinished.
Prince of Eternia and defender of the secrets of Castle Grayskull.
Filmation's fate, the studio that made it all possible. After He-Man, Filmation went through an unceremonious decline. And I'm not kidding. Okay, so in 1969, Filmation was sold to cable operator Teleprompter, right? And then in 1981, Teleprompter was sold to Westinghouse Electric. So now, Filmation was under Westinghouse and was being run under the Group W Productions banner. Now, by the time the late 1980s came, the studio was struggling in a changing animation market. So because of this steep decline in corporate reshuffling, in 1989, Westinghouse's Group W Productions shut down the Filmation plant in Woodland Hills, California, and fired nearly all of the studio's 229 employees in a day. They did this one day before the federal plant closing law would have taken effect. Why? Because this law required 60 days written notice to the staff, and of course Hollywood will do shady stuff whenever possible. Then, the entity that bought Filmation was a European-backed group connected to L'Oreal. You know, the French cosmetics company? Yeah, and this European group that bought the studio's assets was connected to Paravision and Para-France. They had more interest in the cartoon library than in keeping the studio alive. Lou Shamer eventually founded Lou Shamer Productions, but it never created another cultural giant on the scale of He-Man, and Cartoon Brew later noted that he spent years unsuccessfully trying to sell new shows before shutting that company down in 2004. The toy collapse and the live-action disaster. Remember how in a year Mattel saw a massive decrease in toy revenue? Yeah, so with everything considered, Transformers and NES included, Mattel and its partners made one last major effort. They did a live-action theatrical film that was directed by Gary Goddard and produced by Canon Films. This is the He-Man film that came out in 1987 with Dolph Lundgren as He-Man and Frank Langella as Skeletor. This movie story took place on present-day Earth for much of its runtime, partly because a fully Eternia-based fantasy production would have been far more expensive to realize. The film eventually grossed about $17 million against the reported budget of about $22 million. As you can guess, this wasn't the franchise resurrection Mattel needed. But hey, at least you got Langella's Skeletor. This is a stellar performance that brought genuine menace to the table, something the cartoon version of Skeletor rarely had. In the 2020 Vanity Fair interview, Langella reflected on the role and said, "I think it's one of my best performances. I loved doing it." But at this point, there was no full revival left for the original He-Man and the Masters of the Universe wave. So the original toy line was discontinued around that era as Mattel moved on. The Afterlife. Revivals, reboots, and the legacy question. After 1987, with everything said and done, the brand went quiet for a while. Mattel tried to restart it with the New Adventures of He-Man, which ran for 65 episodes around 1990, but it wasn't good enough to restore the old He-Mania. There was no classic Filmation style, and I for one never really felt He-Man belonged in science fiction. Then, in 2002, the show returned to its roots. The rebooted animated series we got on Cartoon Network, courtesy of Young Mike Productions and Four Horsemen Studios. This series was sharper and more serialized, yes, but despite strong fan appreciation, it ended after 39 episodes, with poor toy sales widely understood as one of the major reasons the revival didn't continue. Then, in 2021, Kevin Smith produced Masters of the Universe Revelation on Netflix, which was designed as a continuation of the 1983 series. He tried to close or revisit story arcs that the original show left open, and understandably this was controversial to say the least in the eyes of the original fan base because of the narrative choices made. But this one continued, and as a result we got the Masters of the Universe Revolution on Netflix in 2024. But over the 4 decades, the Masters of the Universe remained consistent in its pattern. Every few years it'll return, find a new audience, gain momentum, and then either transform into something else or pause without the kind of clean ending fans keep wanting. Now, is it because Mattel struggles to manage the property consistently? Or is it because He-Man is better as a premise than as a closed narrative? We don't know. But one thing is clear. This character was created for perpetual motion, and that's probably why we don't get many proper endings, as the showrunners and rights holders keep hoping to expand the universe and get everything out of it, instead of giving us what we want. Did He-Man deserve a proper finale? Yeah, it did. He-Man wrote the economics of children's television. It became a fan favorite for a reason. We still talk about He-Man characters even though it's been years. So when a character is that close to the heart, it deserves a proper finale where we get to say goodbye to the character we grew up with. At least that's how I feel. What do you guys think? Let me know down in the comments below. Like and subscribe as always. Be sure to ring that bell notification so you don't miss any future videos from us. And I'll see you guys next time. Be safe. Have a great one.